The air over the Haitian sugar plantations in 1793 was thick with humidity, sweat, and the unmistakable stench of human misery. From the first glimmer of dawn, the enslaved men, women, and children were forced to rise, their bodies aching from the previous day's labor, only to be thrust back into the endless rows of sugarcane, bending, cutting, and carrying bundles heavier than their own frames. Each movement was measured, each misstep punished, each sigh of exhaustion met with the crack of a whip that cut across the morning air like a blade. The overseers, perched atop horses with eyes as cold as stone, watched with a terrifying vigilance, ensuring that no soul on the plantation dared to falter. There was no room for weakness, no escape from the constant surveillance, and no mercy for those who fell behind. Life was measured in sugar and blood, and the cane fields seemed to stretch into eternity, a green prison under the blazing Caribbean sun. Amid this relentless labor, the mother moved with a quiet but resolute determination. Her hands, calloused and raw, were used to the cutting of cane, but they also held the weight of grief and rage that no whip could ever truly break. She had seen too many family members dragged into the overseer's hut for punishment, their screams echoing across the fields, and she had felt the helplessness of watching her children grow up in a world that considered them less than human. Each day, as she guided her children through the work, teaching them which stalks to cut, which roots to pull, she whispered lessons of survival in a voice both tender and firm, as though preparing them for a world that had already stolen their innocence. The plantation was a kingdom of cruelty, and she had been forced to become both protector and strategist, reading the patterns of her captors as one reads a map of mines in enemy territory. The sugar that flowed from these fields was not merely sweet, it was soaked with suffering. European markets depended on the labor of these enslaved people, and each granule carried the weight of broken bodies and stolen lives. The plantation itself was a fortress of fear, its grand house looming over the fields, a constant reminder of who held power and who had none. The masters, with their fine clothing and cruel smiles, moved through this landscape of toil as though it were a stage, and the enslaved as mere props to be used, discarded, or broken as needed. Their presence was omnipresent, even when out of sight, because the terror they inspired was built into every rule, every expectation, and every punishment. The mother had learned to navigate these rules with a careful eye, noting patterns, remembering faces, and gauging moods, always aware that a single misstep could cost a life. Yet beneath the surface of fear and submission, a quiet storm was growing. Every act of cruelty, every moment of humiliation, fed a fire that the mother had long hidden, even from herself. She had witnessed children torn from their mothers, beaten for laughter or defiance, and adults punished for the smallest perceived slight. She had felt the chill of helplessness as friends and family disappeared into the night, never to return, claimed by the plantation's punishments or sold off to distant lands. And in these moments, in the dark of the night when the cane rustled softly under the wind, she whispered to herself of a reckoning, a day when the scales of power could be overturned, and the weak could strike back at those who had made them suffer. It was a thought that terrified her even as it gave her strength, a dangerous seed planted in the fertile soil of anger and grief. The children, young and small, moved alongside her, their faces a mixture of innocence and a premature understanding of fear. They learned to cut the cane quickly, to avoid the overseer's lash, but they also absorbed the quiet strength in their mother's gaze, a strength that promised protection, that whispered of resistance even when the world screamed submission. She taught them to notice the patterns of the guards, the timing of the master's walks through the fields, the moments when attention wavered and opportunity might be found. Survival in these fields required more than labor. It demanded observation, cunning, and patience. And the mother, though battered and broken in body, had cultivated these qualities in herself and in her children, nurturing the beginnings of something far more dangerous than mere survival, a resolve that could not be shackled. The rhythm of life on the plantation was both monotonous and nightmarish. Days blurred into weeks as the sun rose and fell over endless rows of cane. The weight of the machete in her hand, the sting of the whip, the cries of children, and the distant laughter of the masters all formed a grim symphony of oppression. Every sound, every shadow, became a message, a signal, a warning. And yet, amidst this horror, the mother's mind began to shift from mere endurance to planning, from living to plotting. Each day brought her closer to understanding that survival alone was not enough, that the only way to protect her children, to reclaim dignity, might require a confrontation with the very embodiment of the cruelty that had defined their lives. It was a dark thought, but one nurtured by years of witnessing injustice and despair, and it would guide the path that she and her children would soon take. The plantation's landscape itself seemed to echo the oppression. Cane fields stretched in every direction, dense and whispering with hidden menace, masking secret paths and shadows that could conceal escape or attack. The estate's grand house, with its whitewashed walls and high windows, seemed to mock those who labored below, a constant reminder of the power imbalance. The mother, walking through the fields with her children close behind, felt every injustice pressing down on her shoulders, every humiliation embedding itself into her soul. And yet, in the same oppressive landscape, she began to see possibility. Every misstep of a master, every lapse in oversight, became a crack in the armor of tyranny, a potential opening for action that could forever change the lives of those she loved. The air was thick with danger, but also with a faint, almost imperceptible promise, the promise that even in a world built on suffering, rebellion could take root. As the days stretched on in the merciless heat of the plantation, the mother's mind began to sharpen, her grief and fury hardening into a dangerous clarity. The constant surveillance, the unending toil, and the cruelty inflicted on her children and fellow enslaved people were no longer merely sources of suffering. They were fuel for a growing determination that could not be extinguished. Every lash, every insult, every tear shed by her children became a silent drumbeat echoing in her mind, each one counting down to a reckoning she had long begun to imagine. She had learned to hide her anger, to maintain the mask of submission demanded by the overseers, but beneath the carefully controlled exterior, her mind was alive with strategy and the contours of vengeance. She knew that rash action would mean death, but patience, cunning, and timing could transform despair into power. Her children, young and perceptive, began to sense the undercurrent of change in their mother's demeanor. While they still carried out the daily labor with trembling hands and bowed heads, they noticed the subtle shifts in her gaze, the way her eyes would linger on the masters, tracking their patterns, memorizing their routines. She whispered small lessons to them, under the pretense of teaching survival skills, how to move silently between rows of cane, how to avoid detection, how to recognize moments when the master's attention wavered. Every lesson was layered with meaning, preparing them not just to endure, but to participate in a future plan whose contours they could not yet fully comprehend. In these stolen moments, her children began to understand that their mother was no ordinary woman. She was a force tempered by suffering, and her determination radiated like a silent fire that could not be put out. The psychological toll of life under slavery was immense, yet it also created a kind of clarity in the mother's mind. Pain and grief had stripped away the illusions of safety, morality, and mercy imposed by the plantation system. She had watched neighbors vanish in the night, heard the wails of those beaten or executed for the smallest perceived offense, and felt the bitter injustice of a system that demanded obedience while offering nothing in return. In her grief, she found focus. In her rage, she discovered strategy. She began to map the plantation in her mind with meticulous care, noting every guard post, every path through the cane, every weakness in the overseer's routines. Each observation became a building block in a larger plan, a silent blueprint for action that could not yet be spoken aloud. The mother's inner life was a complex tapestry of fear, grief, and strategic calculation. She felt sorrow for the lives stolen, anger at the master's cruelty, and an almost predatory satisfaction in imagining the overturning of their authority. Yet she also understood the stakes. Failure would mean not just her death, but the death of the children she protected with all her strength. Each act of rebellion had to be calculated with precision, timed to exploit opportunity and minimize risk. She spent nights lying awake on the hard floor of her small quarters, listening to the whispers of the cane fields outside, imagining the sequence of events that could transform them from victims to avengers. Her mind was alive with possibility, and yet haunted by the knowledge that any miscalculation could be fatal. Historical context added weight to her calculations. Stories of earlier revolts in Saint-Domingue circulated quietly among the enslaved population, passed along in whispered conversations and secret gatherings. Rebellion was dangerous, almost certainly fatal, yet it had also proven that the seemingly invincible power of the masters could be challenged. The mother absorbed these accounts with a scholar's intensity, learning from the successes and failures of others. Each story reinforced her understanding that revolt required more than brute strength. It required intelligence, patience, and the ability to exploit every advantage, no matter how small. In this way, her personal vendetta became intertwined with a larger historical pattern of resistance, placing her actions in a continuum of courage and defiance that had persisted despite overwhelming odds. The brutality inflicted upon her children was particularly incendiary. She had watched them flinch under the lash, their small bodies marked with the evidence of the master's cruelty, and she felt a mixture of profound sorrow and burning rage. The children's innocence had been stolen, replaced by a keen awareness of danger and injustice, yet they still possessed a raw, unbroken energy that their mother could harness. She began to prepare them psychologically, using stories, whispered instructions, and careful modeling of courage to instill the belief that they were not powerless. These were not merely lessons in survival. They were early seeds of resistance, laying the groundwork for the pivotal moment when they would act not as victims, but as agents of retribution. In the quiet moments of observation, the mother also began to understand the psychology of the oppressors. She noted their arrogance, their assumptions of absolute control, their belief that fear alone could maintain order. These observations were crucial. She realized that even the most ruthless master relied on routines, on predictability, and on the unquestioned submission of the enslaved. By watching, listening, and calculating, she began to see openings where the veneer of control could be shattered. Every lapse, every moment of inattentiveness, every reliance on routine became a potential leverage point, a place where cunning could turn oppression on its head. The tension built gradually, imperceptibly at first, like a storm forming on the horizon. Every day in the cane fields, every whispered instruction, every small act of covert observation added to the sense that change was coming. The mother's resolve became almost palpable, radiating outward and affecting those around her, even as the masters remained oblivious to the brewing danger. It was a delicate balance between fear and hope, a psychological tightrope where a single misstep could undo all her careful planning. Yet, beneath the surface, a fierce determination continued to grow, a promise to herself, to her children, and to the memory of those who had suffered before them, that the cruelty of the plantation would not go unchallenged. By the time the plan began to crystallize in her mind, it was no longer simply an act of survival or revenge. It had become an expression of justice in a world that offered none, a calculated strike against the tyranny that had ruled their lives. Her grief had been transformed into strategy, her sorrow into purpose, and her rage into a careful, deliberate readiness for action. She moved through the fields with a quiet intensity, preparing her children with lessons cloaked in innocence yet charged with meaning, and marking every detail of the plantation that could later be exploited. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, nurtured by years of suffering and sharpened by an acute understanding of both the human and historical forces at play. And in this crucible of oppression, a mother's fierce love and a child's fledgling courage began to intertwine, setting the stage for an act of defiance that would shake the foundations of the plantation world forever. The night had fallen over the plantation like a thick, suffocating blanket, the moon a pale witness to the horrors and secrets hidden in the fields below. Shadows stretched long across the rows of cane, and the air was alive with the soft rustle of leaves, masking the careful, deliberate movements of the mother and her children. Their small forms moved like ghosts between the stalks, machetes fashioned from sharpened sugarcane gripped tightly in hands that had known both toil and terror. Each step was measured, every sound analyzed, every breath held as though life itself depended on absolute silence. In this darkness, The ordinary rules of the plantation no longer applied, and the children, normally so careful, so afraid, felt the first stirring of empowerment under their mother's fierce guidance. The mother had spent months observing the masters, noting the precise times of their patrols, the moments when their attention wandered, and the predictable patterns of complacency that marked their routines. She had taught her children to read the subtle cues of the overseer's movements, the flicker of a lantern, the shift of a shadow, the sudden pause in distant footsteps. Knowledge, she knew, was as powerful as any weapon, and tonight it would be wielded with deadly precision. The children had been drilled in silence and patience, in moving without leaving traces, in the art of blending with the night. Fear still lingered in their eyes, but it was now tempered with understanding, an unspoken trust in their mother and the plan she had forged from grief, anger, and cunning. As they neared the grand house, the heartbeat of the plantation's cruelty, tension coiled tightly around them like a living thing. The masters, unaware of the storm approaching, lounged in the dimly lit interior, voices carrying faintly across the yard, discussing trivial matters, completely oblivious to the danger that lurked mere meters away. The mother signaled with a subtle hand gesture, and the children froze, their tiny forms merging with the shadows. The quiet was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the house or the whisper of cane against cane. Every second stretched into eternity as the mother's mind raced, calculating the sequence of strikes, the escape routes, and the contingencies should anything go awry. When the moment finally arrived, it was swift and brutal. The mother struck first, a single, precise movement that incapacitated the nearest overseer before he could even draw a weapon. Her children followed with a mixture of horror and exhilaration, the sugarcane knives flashing in the pale moonlight as they moved with practiced ferocity. The plantation masters were caught completely off guard, their arrogance and assumption of control shattered in an instant. Screams filled the air, echoing against the walls of the grand house and across the fields, mingling with the sharp, metallic sound of blades. The children, small yet deadly, became extensions of their mother's will, each strike a manifestation of years of suffering, each motion a calculated act of vengeance. The narrative unfolds with cinematic intensity, portraying the chaos with a balance of horror and empathy. The mother's face, a mixture of grim determination and protective instinct, guides the children through the violence, her eyes scanning, calculating, ensuring that each action furthers their survival. Every master's attempt to resist is met with a swift and decisive response, their cries muffled by the very tools of the plantation, the sharpened cane that had once been a symbol of labor and oppression. In the swirl of movement and panic, the story captures the psychological complexity of the scene, fear, rage, and the thin line between survival and moral transgression. The children, though executing acts of violence, are framed as instruments of necessity, their innocence juxtaposed with the raw brutality of the revolt. Historical context deepens the understanding of the event. Revolts were not uncommon in Saint-Domingue, but the use of children as participants, guided by a parent, was exceptional and terrifying to both the enslaved and the masters. The mother's strategy reflected not only an intimate knowledge of the plantation's layout, but also a profound understanding of human psychology, the assumption that children were harmless, the underestimation of their capacity for action, and the reliance of the masters on routine. This calculated subversion of expectations underscores the intelligence and bravery of the mother, framing her actions within a broader tradition of resistance while highlighting the extreme measures forced by the cruelty of slavery. As the night progressed, the massacre reached its climax. The grand house, once a symbol of untouchable power, became a site of chaos, its walls echoing with the terror of those who had inflicted pain for so long. The mother moved with unrelenting precision, her children responding to her silent cues, executing tasks that belied their youth. The narrative emphasizes the tension of each moment, the fragile balance between success and disaster, and the harrowing psychological weight borne by those carrying out the revolt. Every action is fraught with risk, every sound potentially signaling discovery, yet the mother's careful preparation allows them to maintain control amidst the panic. The ethical complexity of the scene is explored with sensitivity and depth, The audience is invited to feel the horror of the violence while understanding its inevitability within the context of unrelenting oppression. The mother's vengeance is both a moral and survival imperative, a response to years of systemic cruelty and personal loss. The children's participation is depicted with psychological realism, acknowledging their fear and the extraordinary nature of their actions, while framing the revolt as a necessary, if harrowing, assertion of agency in a world that had long denied it. The tension between innocence and violence, fear and empowerment, horror and necessity, creates a gripping narrative that keeps viewers on the edge of their seats. Escape and evasion are integral to the narrative of the night. The mother had planned not only the attack, but also the routes through which they could disappear into the safety of the surrounding cane fields. The narrative portrays their movements with cinematic tension, shadows blending with shadows, footsteps muffled, breaths held, as they slip away from the epicenter of chaos. The night air, once oppressive and suffocating, becomes a cloak for their survival, a silent ally in the aftermath of calculated violence. The audience is drawn into the suspense, experiencing the fear of discovery and the exhilaration of narrowly avoided disaster alongside the mother and her children. The aftermath of the attack within the night itself is a crucible of emotion. Adrenaline, fear, and the first taste of empowerment flood the character's senses. The mother, despite her exhaustion, remains vigilant, her mind already calculating the next steps, aware that the danger is far from over. The children, shaken but emboldened, look to her for guidance, their trust absolute even as the horrors of the night weigh heavily on their young psyches. The narrative delves into this psychological terrain, portraying not only the physical events but the profound internal shifts, the awakening of agency, the confrontation with mortality, and the complex emotions of vengeance and survival. The story concludes the night with the first signs of dawn approaching, the moon retreating and the first streaks of light cutting across the cane fields. The mother and her children, bloodied but alive, have achieved a feat that would echo through the plantation and beyond. Yet even in the immediate aftermath, the stakes remain high, as the colonial system is poised to respond with brutal force. The tension between temporary triumph and the looming threat of reprisal underscores the narrative's dark tone, leaving viewers suspended between horror and awe. The mother's strategy, courage, and unyielding love have forged a moment of defiance that will not soon be forgotten, setting the stage for the chaos, pursuit, and historical consequences that follow. The first light of dawn barely penetrated the dense rows of sugarcane when the echoes of the night's violence still hung in the air, heavy with blood, sweat, and fear. The plantation, once a meticulously ordered machine of oppression, now lay in chaos, its hierarchy shattered, its masters thrown into terror and confusion. The mother moved cautiously through the cane, her children close behind, their eyes wide and alert, scanning every shadow for signs of pursuit. The adrenaline from the night's action was still coursing through their veins, but it was tempered by the cold reality that the danger had only begun. The plantation would not forgive such defiance, and the reprisals would be swift and merciless. Each step forward was a negotiation with death, a delicate dance between survival and exposure. The aftermath of the massacre was a scene of unimaginable disorder. Guards, once confident and rigid in their patrols, now ran in panic, shouting incomprehensible orders that only added to the confusion. Horses whinnied and stamped as the overseers attempted to regain control, and the sounds of shattered glass and overturned furniture reverberated across the estate. The mother's keen mind noted everything: the routes the guards took, the places where their attention was weakest, the moments when fear caused hesitation. Each observation was critical, a lifeline to safety for her and her children. In the chaos, she maneuvered like a phantom, a careful strategist who had trained her children to act in unison, moving silently, while the plantation itself seemed to convulse in response to their defiance. The psychological weight of the night's events pressed heavily upon the mother. She had enacted vengeance, a violent reckoning against those who had inflicted endless suffering on her family, yet she knew the moral and mortal consequences of her actions. Each master she had struck down represented not only a personal victory, but a dangerous escalation. The colonial authorities would come with retribution, and the lives of her children hung in the balance. She forced herself to suppress the tremor of fear that threatened to betray her, focusing instead on the practical, escape routes, hiding places, and the necessity of keeping the children calm and obedient. Fear had transformed into hyper-awareness, and grief had sharpened into an almost unnatural clarity. In this crucible of survival, her maternal instinct became inseparable from tactical genius. The children, though young, were acutely aware of the tension that enveloped them. Their small hands still clutched the sugarcane knives, though their use was now more symbolic than necessary. Their faces, smeared with the grime and blood of the previous night, bore expressions of shock, confusion, and a budding sense of power they had never before known. The mother's whispered instructions guided them through the labyrinth of cane, urging silence, focus, and discipline, while simultaneously nurturing the emotional resilience needed to endure what lay ahead. They had become actors in a grim theater of rebellion, their childhood innocence violently tempered by necessity and survival. The story captures the emotional complexity of these young participants, portraying both their fear and the awakening of courage under the harshest conditions. As the plantation descended further into disarray, the narrative shifts to the perspective of the surviving masters and guards. Panic, disbelief, and anger collide, as those in power struggle to comprehend how a single mother and a handful of children could have executed such a precise and deadly attack. Orders are shouted, searches are organized, and messengers are dispatched to nearby settlements, all while the shadow of fear spreads like wildfire. This section emphasizes the terror and chaos wrought by the revolt, contrasting the helplessness of the oppressors with the strategic calm of the mother. Historical context provides insight into the colonial mindset, revealing the psychological reliance on absolute control and the shock that arises when the illusion is shattered. The contrast between fear and power, chaos and order, drives the suspense and underscores the narrative's dark tone. Amid this turbulence, the mother's mind works tirelessly, plotting every possible contingency. She knows the authorities will not hesitate to pursue, punish, and execute reprisals, and that her children are the most vulnerable in the aftermath. Every path through the cane fields is considered, every potential hiding spot mapped with mental precision, and every sound in the surrounding woods interpreted as either threat or opportunity. The narrative emphasizes the tension of these calculations, portraying a mother who must balance strategy with emotion, cunning with care, and fear with courage. Her psychological depth becomes a focal point, illustrating the extraordinary combination of intellect, instinct, and maternal devotion required to survive in the aftermath of violence. Historical consequences of such revolts are woven into the narrative to heighten tension and provide context. The Haitian plantations of 1793 were not forgiving environments. Colonial law and customary punishment demanded swift and brutal reprisal against rebels. Those caught often faced public execution, torture, or sale into even harsher conditions. By situating the mother's actions within this broader framework, the story underscores both the audacity and the peril of her revolt. Her cunning is amplified by necessity. Every decision, every movement, and every calculated risk becomes a testament to survival in a world designed to crush defiance. The audience is made to feel the stakes viscerally, understanding that the brief triumph of the night could be undone by a single misstep in the hours that follow. As the mother and children navigate the cane fields, the narrative explores the psychological impact of vengeance and survival. The mother experiences fleeting waves of satisfaction, tinged with horror at the blood spilled and the irreversible consequences of her actions. Her children process the events differently. Fear, confusion, and exhilaration intermingle in their minds, shaping a complex emotional landscape. The story examines the intersection of trauma and empowerment, illustrating how acts of resistance, even when morally ambiguous, can forge resilience and self-determination. The tension between moral ambiguity and necessity adds emotional depth, inviting the audience to grapple with the ethical complexity of survival in an oppressive society. The pursuit intensifies as colonial authorities begin to mobilize. Horsemen traverse the surrounding roads, messengers spread word to neighboring plantations, and guards tighten the perimeter, all driven by a combination of rage and panic. The narrative maintains cinematic tension, portraying every shadow, rustle, and distant sound as a potential threat. The mother's strategic mind anticipates each move, her actions a blend of instinct and calculation honed over months of observation. She positions her children in hidden alcoves, directs their movements with subtle gestures, and ensures that every action taken minimizes risk while maximizing the possibility of escape. The suspense is unrelenting, each step forward fraught with danger, yet executed with remarkable precision and calm under pressure. In the final moments of this section, the mother's foresight and preparation allow the group to temporarily evade capture. Hidden among the dense cane, they catch fleeting glimpses of the authorities sweeping the plantation in disorganized panic. The immediate threat is mitigated, though not eliminated. The narrative makes clear that the danger is far from over, and that future challenges will test both courage and cunning. The mother's combination of maternal protection, strategic brilliance, and sheer audacity ensures that her children survive this first crucible, but the long-term consequences of revolt loom large. The audience is left with a heightened sense of suspense, anticipating both the personal and historical repercussions that will unfold in the sections to come. In the weeks that followed the Night of Knives, the plantation was a place transformed, though the transformation was invisible to outsiders who only saw the fields and the whitewashed walls. The fear that had been sown was palpable, lingering in the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. Plantation masters, once confident in their absolute control, moved with caution, glancing over shoulders, their arrogance replaced by suspicion. Word of the massacre had spread, carried on whispers and frightened messengers, embedding itself as a warning to others who might consider underestimating the enslaved. The mother's audacity had struck more than just her oppressors. It had sent a ripple through the colony, a shiver of uncertainty through those who believed that fear alone could maintain their dominion. She had not merely survived. She had reshaped the psychological landscape of power. The mother and her children, though still within the reach of danger, found temporary sanctuary among the cane fields and hidden paths she had meticulously mapped in advance. Survival demanded constant vigilance, yet there was also a quiet, almost surreal sense of empowerment. Each day they evaded capture was a confirmation of their ability to reclaim agency in a world that had long denied them autonomy. The children, once passive victims of circumstance, now moved with a cautious confidence, learning the dual lessons of obedience and cunning, terror and hope. Their young minds absorbed every movement, every whispered instruction, every lesson in reading the human heart and its predictable weaknesses. In these moments, the narrative emphasizes both the psychological growth and the emotional resilience cultivated under extreme conditions, framing survival as an act of quiet heroism. The impact of their revolt extended beyond their immediate survival. Plantation owners spoke in hushed tones about the mother who had led children to strike down their masters, her name becoming a symbol of both fear and fascination. In a society built on terror and domination, her actions represented an extraordinary disruption, an anomaly that unsettled the delicate balance of power. The story explores how colonial authorities responded to such events, combining punitive measures with heightened surveillance, while simultaneously grappling with their own sense of vulnerability. Historical records from this period reveal the panic that such uprisings instilled, particularly when they involved cunning and unanticipated strategies. The mother's revolt was not only an act of personal vengeance, but a psychological strike against the very structure of slavery itself. The narrative delves into the mother's strategic brilliance, highlighting the careful orchestration of her actions. She had prepared not just for the attack itself, but for the aftermath, routes of escape, hidden refuges, and contingencies in case of pursuit. Every step had been considered with precision, a testament to both her intelligence and her deep understanding of human behavior. The children, guided by her, became extensions of this strategy. Their participation carefully managed to maximize both effectiveness and survival. This planning elevates the revolt beyond mere revenge, transforming it into a case study in calculated resistance. The story emphasizes the contrast between the mother's resourcefulness and the plantation master's complacency, framing the narrative as a darkly ironic reversal of power. Yet, the victory was tempered by the ever-present danger of retaliation. Colonial authorities were relentless, and the mother's defiance could not remain hidden forever. The narrative explores the precarious balance between triumph and peril, depicting the psychological tension inherent in living on the edge of discovery. The mother's mind continually calculated risks, while her children internalized the lessons of vigilance and adaptability. The suspense of potential capture remains a central thread, highlighting the relentless pressure under which acts of rebellion were carried out. This tension reinforces the dark, cinematic tone of the story, underscoring the stakes and the extraordinary courage required to maintain freedom, even temporarily, in such a hostile environment. The legacy of the revolt also became a matter of perception and interpretation. Among the enslaved, the mother was a figure of awe, a symbol of possibility in a world that seemed designed to suppress hope. Stories of her courage and tactical brilliance circulated quietly, inspiring others to consider resistance, even in small, covert forms. Among the masters and colonial authorities, she became a figure of terror, a living reminder that control was never absolute, that fear could be disrupted, and that power could be challenged in ways both unexpected and terrifying. The narrative emphasizes this dual perception, exploring how the same act can be simultaneously celebrated and condemned, heroic and horrifying, depending on perspective. This tension deepens the emotional resonance and moral complexity of the story, inviting viewers to grapple with the ambiguity of justice, survival, and vengeance. The story also examines the psychological impact on the children. Though they had participated in acts of extraordinary violence, their development was shaped not only by trauma, but by the empowerment of agency. They learned that courage and cunning could yield tangible results, that fear could be manipulated, and that survival often required morally complex decisions. The narrative explores this complexity with nuance, portraying the children as both victims and actors, innocent and empowered. Their experience is a mirror of the broader tension between oppression and resistance. The mother's guidance transformed their fear into preparedness, their grief into strategy, and their suffering into a form of resilience that would shape their understanding of the world forever. As the weeks continued, the mother's actions began to influence the broader community. Other enslaved individuals observed her tactics and, inspired by her audacity, began to consider their own potential for resistance. Small acts of defiance, refusing orders, sabotaging equipment, or sharing information, became more common, fueled by the knowledge that even the most oppressed could strike back. The narrative situates this personal story within the larger historical context of growing unrest in Saint-Domingue, foreshadowing the broader revolutionary movements that would soon engulf the colony. The mother's revolt, while immediate in its impact, resonates as part of a continuum of resistance, demonstrating how individual courage can ignite collective action. Finally, the narrative captures the enduring tension between empowerment and danger. Each day of survival was a testament to the mother's brilliance and the children's adaptability, yet it was also a reminder of the ever-present threat of discovery and punishment. The story emphasizes the delicate balance between hope and fear, freedom and captivity, triumph and tragedy. The mother's revolt became both a personal victory and a historical echo, a story of resistance that carried profound psychological, emotional, and moral weight. The audience is left to absorb the complexity of this legacy, the power of courage, the cost of defiance, and the haunting knowledge that even acts of heroism exist within a world shaped by brutality and oppression. In the months and years that followed, the mother's audacious revolt left ripples that extended far beyond the confines of a single plantation. Stories of her courage traveled quietly from field to field, whispered in the night by those who had seen the aftermath or heard the terrified reports of the masters. Each retelling became a legend in its own right, a testament to the possibility of resistance in a world that seemed built to crush it. To the enslaved, she embodied a mixture of fearlessness and maternal devotion, a figure who had turned grief and rage into strategic power. To the masters and colonial authorities, she was a living nightmare, a reminder that control was never absolute, and that even the smallest, seemingly powerless individuals could disrupt the carefully maintained order of oppression. Her name, though often unrecorded in official histories, became synonymous with cunning, defiance, and the terrifying unpredictability of rebellion. The revolt also foreshadowed the larger revolutionary movements that would soon engulf Saint-Domingue. While her actions were driven by personal vengeance and the protection of her children, they resonated with a collective yearning for freedom that was already simmering beneath the surface of the colony. The Haitian Revolution, which would erupt fully in the years to come, found its roots in countless acts of resistance like hers, small, desperate, yet fiercely intelligent and emotionally charged. The Mother's Revolt illustrated the potent combination of strategy, psychological insight, and unyielding courage that defined much of this struggle. Her story became part of the moral and tactical fabric of rebellion, influencing how enslaved communities understood their own potential to resist and survive. In this way, personal vengeance intertwined seamlessly with historical significance, creating a narrative that was both intimate and epical. The psychological impact of her revolt on both the oppressed and the oppressors was profound. The enslaved, witnessing what one woman and her children had accomplished, experienced a surge of possibility. If such audacity could succeed, even for a fleeting moment, then perhaps resistance was not only imaginable but achievable. Fear, which had been the master's greatest weapon, was destabilized by her cunning and determination. Conversely, the colonial authorities experienced an unsettling vulnerability. The belief that terror alone could maintain order was shattered, replaced by an acute awareness that oppression could be subverted in ways they had never anticipated. The story highlights this psychological tension, emphasizing the delicate balance of power and the transformative impact that even a single act of rebellion can have on societal structures built upon fear. The Mother herself became an enduring symbol of moral complexity and human resilience. Her actions, though violent and terrifying, were motivated by necessity, love, and a profound sense of justice in a world that offered none. She navigated a labyrinth of fear, grief, and strategic calculation with a combination of maternal instinct and tactical brilliance that few could have matched. Her children, shaped by these extraordinary experiences, carried forward lessons in survival, courage, and adaptability. The narrative portrays them as living repositories of both trauma and empowerment, embodying the paradox of innocence and agency in a world defined by oppression. The audience is invited to wrestle with the ethical ambiguity of her actions, understanding that heroism and horror are often inseparable when survival is at stake. Historical accounts, both contemporary and retrospective, reflect a mixture of condemnation and awe. Some records sought to erase her deeds, framing them as aberrations or the result of malevolent influence, while others, preserved in oral traditions and clandestine writings, celebrated her cunning and bravery. The story examines these dual narratives, emphasizing how history is shaped not only by events, but by the interpretation of those events. In this way, her revolt becomes a case study in both memory and myth-making, illustrating how acts of resistance can be simultaneously celebrated, feared, and obscured. The audience is encouraged to reflect on the selective lens through which history is often viewed, and to consider the untold stories that lie beneath the surface of recorded events. The physical landscape itself became part of the legend. The sugarcane fields, once instruments of oppression, were transformed into arenas of resistance and cunning. Hidden paths, shadowed corners, and the dense maze of stalks became symbols of both danger and possibility. The Mother's intimate knowledge of this terrain allowed her to exploit every advantage, turning the environment into an ally in her struggle. This intimate connection to the land underscores the interplay between strategy and survival, emphasizing that knowledge, observation, and careful planning can elevate even the most marginalized individuals to positions of extraordinary influence. The audience is drawn into this spatial narrative, imagining the labyrinthine cane fields as both prison and sanctuary, a place where fear and agency coexist in tension. As time passed, the legacy of her revolt influenced subsequent generations, both within her family and throughout the wider enslaved community. Her children, having survived the immediate dangers, carried forward not only the memory of their mother's courage, but also the practical lessons in vigilance, observation, and strategy. Oral histories preserved in whispers and stories kept the flame of her defiance alive, inspiring acts of resistance in plantations across the colony. The narrative emphasizes the generational and communal dimensions of her legacy, illustrating how a single act of courage can ripple outward, shaping consciousness, behavior, and cultural memory. Her revolt becomes more than a momentary event. It becomes a thread woven into the larger fabric of struggle, resilience, and revolutionary fervor. Finally, the narrative reflects on the haunting permanence of her actions. Though the immediate threat of pursuit eventually waned, the memory of the revolt lingered, a specter that haunted masters, inspired the enslaved, and echoed through history. The mother's combination of maternal devotion, strategic acumen, and moral courage created a legacy that was both intimate and historical, personal and universal. Her story exemplifies the complex interplay of human emotion, survival instinct, and social resistance, leaving an indelible impression on all who encountered it, whether directly, through observation, or indirectly, through the retelling of her deeds. The cinematic imagery of her navigating the sugarcane fields, shadows playing across her determined face, and the children moving silently at her side, remains etched in memory, a symbol of defiance, intelligence, and unyielding courage in the darkest of circumstances. As the years passed, the story of the mother and her children became more than a tale of revolt. It became a symbol of defiance, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family forged in the fires of oppression. The plantation, once an unassailable fortress of cruelty, was now forever marked by her actions, even if the landscape outwardly returned to a semblance of order. To the enslaved, her courage remained a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the most hopeless circumstances, agency could be reclaimed and justice, though harsh and personal, could be enacted. The children, now older, carried within them the lessons of that fateful night, the necessity of cunning, the strength of unity, and the enduring power of a mother's love. Their lives, forever shaped by the violence they had witnessed and participated in, became living testaments to survival and strategic resistance. Historical memory treated the revolt with a mixture of fear, fascination, and deliberate omission. Colonial records often minimized or obscured her deeds, framing them as aberrations, while oral traditions preserved them with reverence and careful attention to detail. Her name, whispered from one enslaved generation to the next, became a legend, a moral and psychological touchstone illustrating the capacity for courage and cunning in the face of systemic brutality. Historians looking back centuries later would note the event as an early spark of resistance that anticipated broader revolutionary movements, acknowledging how acts of individual bravery could inspire collective consciousness. Yet the true emotional weight of her actions was preserved primarily in the hearts of those who had lived it, passed down in stories that carried both caution and inspiration. The narrative closes with reflection on the psychological and moral complexities inherent in her story. The mother's revolt was violent, terrifying, and morally ambiguous, yet it was also an act of profound necessity and love. It challenged the audience to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that in systems built on cruelty and dehumanization, survival and justice can require choices that defy conventional notions of morality. Her children, witnesses and participants in this dark chapter, became symbols of both innocence lost and resilience gained. Their experiences demonstrate that human agency can persist even in the most oppressive circumstances, and that courage can manifest in forms both unexpected and profoundly transformative. The cinematic imagery of her life lingers, the dense cane fields rustling under a faint wind, shadows playing across determined faces, the glint of sharpened sugarcane knives catching the moonlight, and the quiet, resolute steps of a mother leading her children through danger. Each element of this imagery underscores the story's tension, its emotional depth, and its historical significance. The revolt is framed not only as a series of actions, but as a profound psychological drama, highlighting the interplay between fear, love, anger, and intelligence. In this way, the narrative leaves a lasting impression, conveying both the horror of the events and the extraordinary humanity required to navigate them. Finally, the story invites reflection on the enduring power of resistance and the ways in which courage can ripple through history. While the mother's immediate actions were born of personal vengeance and protective instinct, their consequences extended far beyond the individual, shaping collective memory and inspiring others to recognize the possibility of defiance. The revolt, though violent and morally complex, represents a triumph of agency, strategic thinking, and maternal love in a world designed to suppress both. It reminds the audience that even in the darkest corners of history, light can emerge through acts of bravery, foresight, and the unyielding will to protect those we love. In the end, the mother's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of systemic oppression. It is a narrative of horror and empowerment, suffering and strategy, innocence lost and courage gained. Her actions, and those of her children, remain a haunting reminder that even under the most brutal circumstances, the human drive for justice, survival, and protection of loved ones can overcome fear and oppression. The echoes of that night in 1793 continue to resonate across history, a darkly luminous thread connecting past suffering with enduring hope and demonstrating the extraordinary capacity for resistance that exists within the human heart.